Hello, everyone. This is Pastor McGill, Senior Pastor at Rock of Ages Christian Fellowship Center. And on this evening, for a brief moment, I would like to talk about Christian virtues. Christian virtues. Even though we live in a time of uncertainty, even though we live in a time where there's calamity and chaos, God still expects believers to exemplify the characteristics of God. I know it's bad, I know it's rough, I know it's tough, but God is calling us to be the light in the midst of the darkness. He is calling us to be the salt of the earth, one who do not lose its flavor. But on today, I want to talk about generosity. Generosity is the virtue of being abundant in your giving, the quality of being kind and generous. In other words, you're unselfish in what you do for others. You be generous just because that's the right thing to do. You're not looking for anything in return. And there are many scriptures in the Bible that support being generous. Proverbs 11 and 25 says, "A generous person will prosper. Whoever refreshes others will be refreshed." Plain and simple. You be generous, you shall prosper. Whoever refreshes others shall be refreshed. Psalms 37 and 21 said, "The wicked borrow and do not repay, but the righteous give generously." Luke 11 and 41 said, "But now as for what is inside of you, be generous to the poor, and everything will be clean for you." So God is even commanding us to be generous to the poor. 2 Corinthians 9 and 6 says, "Remember this, whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows generously will also reap generously." So in other words, you have to be able to be generous and not be stingy and not be tight, but being able to give freely and be a cheerful giver in whatever you're doing. And when you talk about sowing, and sometimes you may have to encourage somebody with a word. Sometimes maybe you may have to help somebody out with food. Sometimes you may have to just sit down and listen to someone so they can get everything off their chest. And so it's important to know that there's many aspects of life for being generous. And I want to share a story with you with someone who was very generous, coming from Luke 10:25 through 37. One day, an expert in religious law stood up to test Jesus by asking him this question: "Teacher, what should I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus replied, "What does the law of Moses say? How do you read it?" The man answered, "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." "Right," Jesus told him. "Do this and you will live." The man wanted to justify his actions, so he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" And Jesus replied with a story. There was a Jewish man was traveling to Jerusalem, down to Jericho. He was attacked by bandits. They stripped him of his clothes. They beat him. They left him half dead beside the road. By chance, a priest come along, but when he saw the man lying there, he crossed to the other side of the road and passed him by. A temple assistant walked over and looked at him lying there, but he also passed him by on the other side. Then a despised Samaritan came along, and when they saw the man, he felt compassion for him. Going over to him, the Samaritan soothed his wounds with olive oil and wine and bandaged them. Then he put the man on his own donkey and took him to an inn, where he took care of him. The next day he handed the innkeeper 2 silver coins, telling him, "Take care of this man, and if his bills run higher than this, I'll pay you the next time I'm here." Now, which of these three would you say was a neighbor to the man who was attacked by bandits? Jesus asked. The man replied, "The one who showed him mercy." Then Jesus said, "Yes, now go and do the same thing." And so when we look at this story, just to give you a background, the Jews despised the Samaritan. They considered them to be half breed. And so you have this man that's lying, in the ditch left for dead. And you would think the priest, who is a man of God, would take time out and have some compassion, show some mercy. And when I look at this, even the temple assistant, how he passed them by. And so when I look at this story, I ask myself, am I showing compassion to my fellow neighbor? Am I loving as God has commanded me to love? And so there's a question you must ask yourself. And when I look at it, don't get caught up in religion. Don't get caught up in your title, your position, or what power you may think you have. Don't get caught up in your finances. God is calling us to be generous to one another, to love one another as we love ourselves, but most importantly, love God. And if we keep that commandment, if we love God and then love our neighbor as ourselves, then we will do a lot of things better than we are doing right now. And so God is calling us to have compassion on our fellow man. He showed compassion to the Good Samaritan. Despite the risk of him being robbed, despite the fact that he was considered a half-breed, they did not like the Good Samaritans. They did not like them at all. But yet, the Samaritans show a Jew who despised him compassion. And so God is calling you to show compassion, even if people despise you, because God's going to bless you for being generous. That's why I say, if you sow sparingly, you reap sparingly. If you be generous, God's going to be generous to you. And so when we walk in this earth, we got to do the right thing, do what God have commanded us, and know that God is the one who's going to bless us for our doing. Even when the man took him there, he bandaged him up, poured olive oil and wine on him, and he took him to an inn room. It even told the guy that if you keep him, and I'm giving you two silver pieces of silver right now, and if the bill is higher, then when I come back, I will make sure I pay you for all of your service. He could have been one who just paid him for that moment and left and went on about his business and didn't worry about how he was going to pay him. Y'all, God is calling his people, the believers, the church, to love one another, be compassionate. There's no space in heaven for people who have hatred in their heart, people who have bigotry, people who are racist. There's no space in heaven for you. Look beyond people color. Look beyond people socioeconomic status. Look beyond people who have the right last name. But look at people as being your neighbor. So your neighbor is not just the people you like. Your neighbor is not just people who live next door to you, but it's anybody you come in contact with. And God is telling us to be generous. Those who are in need, that you can bless, help them. Those who just need a shoulder to cry on, be that shoulder for your neighbor. And so when we sum this story up, Jesus is telling them to love thy neighbor as yourself. But most important, love God. And if we can keep those two commandments, everything else will manifest in the will of God. And so God is calling us to be generous, be kind to someone. How can we become generous? Give as a first response. Fund a call based on your compassion. Spend time with people in need. Start small and start intentional. And so the word, be intentional about being generous to other people. Consider the benefits of generosity. Be grateful always. And so God is calling us to be generous. In this story, Jesus tells us that we have to be generous. If we just look at the life of Jesus, how he healed the sick, he raised the dead, and how he was betrayed by one of his very own disciples. And even being, but knowing it was going to be betrayed, he broke bread and gave thanks and still was generous to him in spite of him knowing that he was going to betray him. So what you think that tells us we should do? Even though we know people are not right, even though we know people may betray us, he's telling us to still be kind, still be generous. And so it's important when we look at the life of Jesus, how he marched up Calvary, and back up a little further, how they whipped him all night long, marching from judgment hall to judgment hall, put a crown of thorns on his head. They beat him so that he was not recognizable. He was in pain. And yet, even in the pain, he was still generous. He said, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. And so God is calling believers to show the love of God to those who are lost. Have compassion on your fellow man. Look beyond the fault of your fellow man. The Bible says love covers a multitude of sin. Are you the priest? Are you the temple assistant? Are you the good Samaritan? That is a question that one may ask themselves. But I choose on this day to be generous to those who are in need. So for homework, find at least one person to generously bless this week. I pray this be a blessing to you. I pray that it help you and help those who are around you. Be blessed and have a good night.